Hello, I'm Dr. Karen Horridge, Disability Paediatrician in South Tyneside and Sunderland. I'm going to be talking in this presentation about the care pathways that we have developed for disabled young people as they approach transition to adulthood. The overarching goal of all the care that we provide is equal access to appropriate care to achieve the best possible outcomes for everybody. We would like all disabled young people and their families to have the opportunity to discuss their wishes and to have all of their needs identified and documented. This is so that they can receive the right care that's appropriate to all of their multifaceted needs. We aspire for this to happen at every step throughout transition to adulthood and adult services and on an ongoing basis throughout the life of the young person and then young adult. We want the right teams to be involved with the expertise to identify and address each and every need on a continuous basis. Key messages from this presentation are once again stressing the importance of the identification of learning disability in a timely way during childhood, so as to minimise the morbidity and mortality that we otherwise know can occur across the lifespan. If we've correctly identified and flagged learning disability, then reasonable adjustments can be made to bridge that gap to ensure that people with a learning disability are included and valued and treated fairly and equally and properly across all settings. So once a learning disability has been identified, we need to flag it on medical records and across agencies. If a learning disability is not correctly identified and flagged during childhood, then the risk is that the learning disabled young person and adult will miss out on the specialist services that they might otherwise have benefited from. And this will include missing out on their annual learning disability health checks with the general practice team, to which they're entitled from 14 years and onwards. Also fundamental to choosing the right care pathway for a young person is very careful planning to ensure that young people access healthcare that is appropriate to the complexity of their needs throughout the transition process and on into adulthood. And it's our responsibility of paediatricians to ensure that that planning takes place and discussions with our colleagues take place. So then the first part of the pathway is to identify learning disability, and there's a separate presentation that you can access that gives a structured approach to that. Having identified the learning disability, we flag medical records, we notify GPs so that names can be added to learning disability practice registers. We then need to identify the cohort of young people whose medical needs are likely to require ongoing specialist secondary health care in addition to the input of the general practice team. So it's beholden on us paediatricians to identify who that lead is going to be in secondary health care, so that we can successfully hand on the baton of leadership and coordination of care. That person might vary depending on the needs of the young person and depending on local arrangements. So for example, it might be the neurorehabilitation consultant or neurology consultant. It might be the respiratory consultant, might be the endocrinologist, might even be the healthcare of the elderly consultant, depending on local arrangements. Those young people with the most highly complex needs, including those with technology dependencies or who are at risk of early death, for that group we need to be having early discussions with our colleagues in adult palliative care teams and plan extended transition periods where necessary to ensure that the family have time to build up relationships with the new team whilst continuing to be supported by their existing team. So, step one, healthcare for all young people with a learning disability. We want to identify those with a learning disability, and we can use the Needs for Pathways tool to calculate the complexity of needs and then to reflect on which pathway is most appropriate. All this does is simply adds up the number of needs across health conditions, areas of function, environmental factors, family reported needs, technology dependencies, and need or not for round-the-clock care. So those with the least complex needs could be managed in primary care, those with more complicated needs with a secondary care lead, and those with the most complex needs are going to move on to step 3 with input from the adult palliative team. So we want to make sure that we paediatricians write to GPs to make sure that young people with a learning disability's names are on the practice learning disability register, and that will allow the GP then to offer annual flu immunisations and annual learning disability health checks from the age of 14 years and onwards. It's our local practice to share with families and with GPs the resources that we've co-developed with learning disabled people, family carers and other experts, learningdisabilitymatters.co.uk. This is a suite of resources that includes a validated screening tool for learning disability, where there's any doubt about whether it's present or not to use in advocacy, and lots of resources and examples of good practice and the voices of young people and their families talking about the reasonable adjustments that have helped them the most. So for those with ongoing medical needs that require secondary healthcare input, we need to identify that need in secondary healthcare services. We need to keep the family informed at every step, discuss with them, make sure we robustly hand on that baton for leadership and coordination of secondary healthcare with the right teams involved. If the person has a learning disability, that might include the learning disability team or the transition team if there is one locally, mindful always of NICE clinical guideline 43 about the transition process. So as we said, those are the most complex needs, which will include young people where we think there's a risk of early death. We've got multiple technology dependencies and have probably 11 or more health conditions, family reported issues and wider needs. This is the group where we need to be having early conversations with our adult palliative team to find out if their input might be useful and to plan in a multidisciplinary way, always including the GP in the loop and any secondary healthcare clinicians that need to be involved. So why is it important that we don't just leave everything to the GP? Well, it's important so that each young person's needs continue to be met with the best possible outcome opportunities. It's important because many reports have told us that families otherwise feel that they stop being supported or feel like they're falling off a cliff from services. Also, GPs stop feeling supported and the primary healthcare team because they're being asked to deal with super specialist areas which are not perhaps as familiar to them. So I do believe it's the paediatrician's responsibility to identify the appropriate adult colleague to hand that baton onto and agree who will continue care. And always we must keep the young person, family, GP, learning disability team fully informed at every step. So why involve the adult palliative team for those with the most complex needs? Some young people are probably surviving a lot longer than they would even a decade ago, are extremely medically frail just as they're approaching that important transition to adulthood and adult services. We paediatricians need to consider the risk of type 2 respiratory failure around that transition time. And we need to think, have we considered and assessed whether this young person might be a risk of an early death? Would we be surprised if the young person died in the next year? So this medically frail group of young people are likely to have very many multiple needs and be on a range of medicines. Our adult palliative colleagues and teams have expertise in holistic assessment of needs, management of complexity of needs, and support of difficult symptoms. We always need to ensure that decision making is joint with the young person wherever possible and with their family, and take into account their wishes, dreams and needs. We need to make sure that we've talked in advance about a young person and their family's views, about levels of intervention that are appropriate, about whether they want cardiopulmonary resuscitation or not, or whether it's likely to be successful or not, about any preferences for place of care and the like. We need to ensure that all of this is carefully documented in the emergency healthcare plan in whatever format is the local currency in the local area, and to ensure that these documents are available, are updated and transparent. We need to recognise those changes in legal frameworks that underpin the decision-making processes for young people as they transition and become young adults. And always we need to keep the best interests of the young person as paramount, take account of the views of the family and those that know the young person best in all decision making. So in summary, at every step of the way, we need to listen to the young person and their family. We need to give them the space to sensitively discuss their wishes and make sure that each and every need is made visible, documented, and that there is an ongoing plan for everything to be addressed. If a learning disability is present, it should be given its name, flagged, and everybody notified that needs to know. We need to consider and calculate the complexity of a young person's needs so that we can make informed choices with the family about the appropriate care pathway to achieve the very best outcomes on transition to adulthood and adult services. Thank you for listening.